Paris, October 16, 1793. The blade falls with the weight of 1,000 years of monarchy, severing not just flesh and bone, but the very soul of an empire. In the blood-soaked square where kings once ruled, a woman who wore diamonds like dewdrops now kneels before the executioner's block, her white hair catching the morning light like spider silk. Was this justice, or was this the murder of innocence? History remembers Marie Antoinette as the queen who bankrupted France with her excess, the Austrian spy who betrayed her adopted homeland, the callous aristocrat who supposedly said, "Let them eat cake." But in these final moments, as the crowd roars for her blood and the guillotine's shadow falls across her face, she is something else entirely. A 37-year-old woman whose only crime may have been being born into a world that demanded perfection from its queens and offered nothing but hatred in return. The revolution, that promised liberty, equality, and fraternity, has become a machine that devours its own children. And Marie Antoinette, once the most powerful woman in Europe, now stands as perhaps its most tragic victim. Her hands, once adorned with rings worth kingdoms, now tremble as they're bound behind her back. The crowd that once cheered her arrival at Versailles now screams for her death. But was she truly the monster they believed her to be? Or was she simply a young girl who became a convenient scapegoat for a nation's rage? Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna was born into a world of unimaginable privilege on November 2nd, 1755, within the golden walls of Vienna's Hofburg Palace. As the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and Holy Roman Emperor Francis I, she was raised in one of Europe's most powerful courts, where diplomacy was taught alongside dancing and political marriages were arranged like chess moves. The young Archduchess possessed a natural charm that captivated everyone around her. Her tutors praised her quick wit and musical talents. She could play the harp and harpsichord with remarkable skill, and her voice carried melodies that seemed to float through the palace corridors like whispered secrets. Yet beneath this polished exterior lay a spirited girl who preferred outdoor adventures to formal lessons, who laughed too loudly at court functions, and who possessed an infectious joy that would both enchant and later enrage the French people. Maria Theresa, known as the Mother of Europe for her strategic matrimonial alliances, had grand plans for her daughter. At just 14 years old, Maria Antonia was selected to marry the future King of France, Louis Auguste, sealing a crucial alliance between Austria and France, two nations that had been enemies for centuries. The marriage would transform the Austrian princess into Marie Antoinette, Dauphine of France. No one could have predicted that this bright, music-loving girl would one day be called l'Autrichienne, the Austrian, with venom dripping from French tongues. No one anticipated that her natural extravagance, so charming in Vienna's relaxed court, would become a symbol of everything the French people despised about their monarchy. As she prepared to leave her homeland forever, dancing through her final weeks in Austria, Marie Antoinette had no way of knowing she was waltzing toward her own destruction. The seeds of her downfall were planted not in malice, but in the simple fact that she would forever remain a foreigner in the land she was meant to rule. The marriage ceremony at Versailles on May 16, 1770, was a spectacle of unprecedented grandeur. The royal chapel glittered with thousands of candles as 15-year-old Marie Antoinette wed 16-year-old Louis Auguste, the awkward scholarly Dauphin who would one day become Louis XVI. The festivities included the inauguration of the Royal Opera, and for a brief, shining moment, The young couple symbolized hope for a new era of Franco-Austrian friendship. But fairy tales have a way of curdling into nightmares. The French court, with its labyrinthine etiquette and suffocating rituals, proved to be a prison disguised as paradise. Marie Antoinette, accustomed to Austria's more relaxed protocols, struggled with Versailles' complex ceremonies, the elaborate morning dressing rituals where dozens of courtiers watched her every move, the formal dining where she ate under the scrutinizing gaze of the public, the endless parade of audiences and obligations that left no room for the spontaneity she craved. More devastating still was her husband's coldness. Louis Auguste, consumed by his love of locksmithing and hunting, showed little interest in his beautiful wife. Their marriage remained unconsummated for 7 agonizing years, a humiliation whispered about in every salon across Europe. The young queen, starved for affection and desperate to fill the emotional void, threw herself into the frivolous pleasures available to her: gambling, fashion, elaborate parties, and the construction of her private paradise at the Petit Trianon. What began as innocent attempts to find happiness became ammunition for her enemies. Every new dress was scrutinized, every card game dissected, every laugh at her private gatherings twisted into evidence of her callous indifference to the suffering of common French people. The Austrian princess, who had once charmed Vienna's court with her naturalness, now found herself trapped in a role she could never perfect: that of the French queen, who must be simultaneously magnificent and modest, visible yet invisible, human yet untouchable. The love she sought from her husband, she found instead in material pleasures and the flattery of courtiers. Each diamond necklace, each extravagant ball, each renovation of her beloved Petit Trianon became another thread in the rope that would eventually strangle her reputation. She was not yet 25, but already the foundation of her destruction was being laid, stone by glittering stone. The whispers began in the shadowed alcoves of Versailles, spreading like poison through the marble corridors where courtiers gathered to dissect their queen's every gesture. What had once been seen as youthful exuberance was now reinterpreted through a darker lens. Marie Antoinette's laughter became hysteria. Her love of fashion became obsession. Her attempts to create privacy became suspicious secrecy. The diamond necklace affair of 1785 shattered whatever remained of her reputation, though she was entirely innocent, never even seeing the magnificent piece of jewelry that bankrupted Cardinal de Rohan. The scandal painted her as a manipulative schemer who would destroy anyone to satisfy her material greed. Pamphlets flooded Paris depicting her as a sexual deviant, a spendthrift, and most dangerously as l'Autrichienne, the foreign spy who served Austria's interests above France's. Every emotional response was weaponized against her. When she wept at her mother's death, she was called unstable. When she celebrated her children's milestones, she was accused of lavish excess. When she retreated to her beloved Petit Trianon to escape the suffocating protocols of court life, playing shepherdess in her pastoral paradise, the people saw it as evidence of her disconnection from reality. How could a queen pretend to be a simple milkmaid while her subjects starved? The court physicians, eager to explain the queen's perceived erratic behavior, began documenting what they called her nervous conditions. Her periods of melancholy after miscarriages were pathologized. Her bursts of energy and enthusiasm for new projects were labeled as dangerous instability. Medical men who had never treated a patient spoke with authority about the foreign queen's unbalanced humors and hereditary Austrian madness. What no one seemed to consider was that Marie Antoinette was simply a young woman trapped in an impossible situation, desperate for genuine human connection, in a world where every relationship was transactional, every conversation monitored, and every emotion scrutinized for political advantage. The madness they saw was nothing more than the natural response of a human spirit, slowly being crushed by the weight of expectations she could never meet and hatred she could never understand. The death of Louis XV in 1784 thrust 19-year-old Marie Antoinette into a role she was catastrophically unprepared for: Queen of France. Her husband, now Louis XVI, proved to be a weak and indecisive monarch, more comfortable in his workshop crafting locks than wielding the power of absolute monarchy. Into this vacuum stepped forces that would tear the young queen apart like wolves circling wounded prey. The court faction system that had simmered beneath the surface during the old king's reign now erupted into open warfare. Marie Antoinette found herself caught between competing noble houses, each seeking to use her influence to advance their own agendas. The Duke of Orléans, Louis XVI's ambitious cousin, positioned himself as the people's prince while secretly orchestrating attacks on the queen's reputation. The devout party, led by the king's aunts, criticized her Austrian connections and her failure to produce an heir quickly enough. Foreign ambassadors pressed her to advocate for their nation's interests, while French ministers demanded her loyalty to policies she barely understood. The Queen's every decision became a political calculation with devastating consequences. When she supported the American Revolution, she was accused of bankrupting the treasury for foreign adventures. When she opposed it, she was called heartless toward the cause of liberty. Her attempts to place friends in court positions were labeled favoritism and corruption. Her efforts to stay above political intrigue were interpreted as Austrian manipulation, the foreign queen secretly pulling strings for her homeland's benefit. Most cruelly, her voice began to disappear from the very conversations that would determine her fate. Ministers spoke around her, making decisions that would be attributed to her influence without her knowledge. Policies she had never endorsed were blamed on her interference. Treaties she had never seen were attributed to her foreign loyalties. The queen, who was supposedly pulling all the strings, was, in reality, becoming increasingly powerless, watching helplessly as her reputation was demolished by forces entirely beyond her control. By the 1780s, Marie Antoinette had become less a person than the symbol, a convenient scapegoat for every failure of the monarchy, every economic crisis, every unpopular decision. She was the perfect target, foreign, female, and unable to defend herself without seeming to prove her critics right. The legal heir to immense power had become a prisoner of that very inheritance, trapped in a system that demanded she be both omnipotent and invisible, decisive and submissive, French and forever foreign. The revolution erupted around Marie Antoinette like a storm she had watched gathering for years, but never truly believed would break. On October 5, 1789, thousands of Parisian women marched to Versailles, demanding bread, their voices rising in a chorus of rage that shattered the crystalline world the Queen had inhabited for nearly 2 decades. As they stormed through the palace corridors, hunting for l'Autrichienne, Marie Antoinette fled through secret passages in her nightgown, her feet bare against the cold marble floors that had once supported her in silk slippers worth a peasant's yearly wages. The family's forced removal to the Tuileries Palace in Paris marked the end of everything she had known. Gone were the manicured gardens of Versailles, the pastoral fantasies of Petit Trianon, the elaborate court ceremonies that had given structure to her days. In their place came a prison disguised as a palace, where hostile crowds gathered daily outside the windows, screaming for her blood while she tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy for her terrified children. But it was the failed flight to Varennes in June 1791 that became Marie Antoinette's defining symbolic moment, the image that would haunt her to the grave. Dressed as a governess, traveling under false papers with her family in a heavily loaded carriage, the queen, who had once commanded the attention of European courts, was reduced to a fugitive fleeing her own subjects. When they were recognized and dragged back to Paris like common criminals, the sight of the royal family behind bars in their carriage became a powerful metaphor for the fall of divine right monarchy. The journey back to Paris was a funeral procession for the old world. Crowds lined the roads in complete silence, their hats firmly planted on their heads in deliberate disrespect, refusing to acknowledge the royalty of their former sovereigns. Marie Antoinette, dressed in simple black mourning clothes, stared out the carriage window at faces twisted with hatred and contempt. The woman who had once inspired fashion trends across Europe now became a symbol of everything the people despised: privilege, excess, foreignness, and most unforgivably, the audacity to try to escape the fate they had prepared for her. This was no longer about politics or policy. This had become something deeper, more primal, a ritual sacrifice where Marie Antoinette would pay for centuries of royal indifference with her life. The carriage wheels that carried her back to captivity were grinding out the rhythm of her approaching death, and everyone, the guards, the crowds, and the queen herself, could hear it in the autumn air of 1791. On August 13, 1792, the gates of the Temple prison clanged shut behind Marie Antoinette with the finality of a tomb being sealed. The medieval fortress, with its massive stone towers rising like accusatory fingers against the Parisian sky, would become her world for the next year, a universe measured in footsteps across cold flagstones and hours marked by the changing of hostile guards. The temple had once housed the Knights Templar, those warrior monks who had served medieval kings with absolute devotion. Now it would imprison the last queen of France, and the bitter irony was not lost on Marie Antoinette as she climbed the narrow spiral staircase to her chambers. At 37, she was entering what should have been the prime of her life, yet her hair had already begun turning white from the stress of watching her world collapse. The order for her imprisonment came not from strangers, but from the very nation she had tried to serve as queen. The National Convention, drunk on revolutionary fervor, had decided that the Austrian woman posed too great a threat to the new republic. She was no longer Marie Antoinette, Queen of France. She was simply prisoner number 280, an enemy of the people whose very existence challenged their vision of a world without kings. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical cruelty. These were not foreign invaders who had captured her, but her own subjects, people who had once bowed when she passed, who had celebrated her arrival at Versailles with tears of joy. Now they spoke of her as if she were a plague that needed to be contained, a cancer that threatened to destroy their revolutionary dreams. In her tower room, surrounded by her children and sister-in-law, Madame Elisabeth, Marie Antoinette tried to create some semblance of normal family life. She read to her daughter Marie-Thérèse, played games with 8-year-old Louis Charles, and attempted to maintain the routines that at once anchored her days. But outside their windows, Paris burned with revolutionary fever, and inside the stone walls, the shadows seemed to grow longer each day, reaching toward a future that held only darkness. The temple's stone walls wept with dampness that seeped into Marie Antoinette's bones like a slow-acting poison. Winter arrived early in 1792, and with it came a cold that no amount of firewood could banish from the medieval fortress. The queen, who had once commanded armies of servants to tend to her every need, now found herself at the mercy of guards who took perverse pleasure in her degradation. The daily humiliations were designed to break her spirit, as methodically as water wearing away stone. Guards blew tobacco smoke directly into her face during their card games, laughing as she coughed and turned away. They spoke about her in the third person while she sat mere feet away, discussing her fate with the casual cruelty of butchers appraising cattle. The elaborate court etiquette that had once governed every moment of her life was replaced by the harsh rhythms of prison routine, meals of thin broth shoved through cell doors, chamber pots that went unemptied for days, and the constant presence of armed men who watched her sleep. Her once lustrous hair, already whitening from stress, began falling out in clumps. The hands that had once been soft as silk became rough and cracked from the cold. Her clothes, no longer replaced by an army of seamstresses, grew threadbare and stained. The woman who had set fashion trends across Europe now wore the same black dress day after day, its fabric slowly disintegrating like her former life. But the cruelest torture was watching her children suffer. Her daughter Marie-Thérèse, barely 14, aged years and months as she witnessed her mother's systematic destruction. 8-year-old Louis Charles, once a robust and laughing boy, became pale and withdrawn, clinging to his mother's skirts as if sensing the approaching separation. When the guards finally came for him in July 1793, tearing him from Marie Antoinette's arms to place him with the cobbler Antoine Simon, her screams echoed through the tower's corridors like the cries of a wounded animal. The boy they returned to her during brief, supervised visits was unrecognizable, dirty, foul-mouthed, and taught to denounce his own mother as an enemy of the people. Simon had taken perverse pleasure in corrupting the young prince, plying him with wine until he was drunk, teaching him obscenities and beating him when he cried for his mother. Marie Antoinette watched her son's innocence being murdered before her eyes, and there was nothing she could do but extend her hands through the bars and whisper words of love that seemed to reach him less and less. By the summer of 1793, the woman who had once been the most envied queen in Europe had been reduced to a broken shadow, her body failing, her spirit crushed, and her children stolen. Yet somehow, in the depths of her despair, she found the strength to endure what was still to come. In the spring of 1793, a flicker of hope pierced the darkness of Marie Antoinette's imprisonment like a single candle flame in a cathedral's shadows. The Girondins, moderate revolutionaries who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the radical direction of the revolution, began quietly debating her fate. Some suggested she might be exchanged for French prisoners held by the Austrian armies, while others proposed exile to America, the distant republic that had once benefited from French support during its own revolution. Thomas Paine, the very architect of American independence, advocated for her banishment rather than execution. "Let her live in exile," he argued before the National Convention. as a reminder that republics show mercy where monarchies showed none. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that Marie Antoinette might escape the fate that had befallen her husband, that she might live to see her children grow up in some foreign land far from the blood-stained streets of Paris. Even more promising were the whispered conversations between moderate deputies who had begun to recognize that the revolution was devouring its own children. Jacques-Pierre Brissot and other Girondin leaders spoke privately about the need to end the terror, to restore some semblance of legal order to France. Marie Antoinette, they argued, was no longer a threat to the Republic. She was a broken woman, a mother separated from her children, a symbol of a past that had already been thoroughly destroyed. The Queen herself dared to hope during those spring days of 1793. In her cell at the Temple, she wrote letters to her children that she prayed might one day reach them. She spoke with Madame Elisabeth about the possibility of seeing Vienna again, of walking through the gardens of Schönbrunn Palace where she had played as a child. Perhaps, she whispered to her sister-in-law, they might yet escape this nightmare. But hope in revolutionary France was as fragile as morning frost. By summer, the moderate voices had been silenced. Brissot and his allies were themselves marked for death, and the radical Jacobins had seized complete control of the government. The brief window of possibility slammed shut with the force of a guillotine blade, and Marie Antoinette found herself facing a future darker than anything she had yet imagined. On the night of August 1st, 1793, Marie Antoinette was awakened by the harsh clatter of keys and the heavy footsteps of guards echoing through the temple's corridors. They had come for her at last, separating her from her daughter Marie-Thérèse and sister-in-law Madame Elisabeth with the cold efficiency of executioners. As she was led away into the darkness, her final glimpse of the temple was of her 14-year-old daughter's tear-streaked face pressed against the barred window, an image that would haunt her remaining days. The Conciergerie, that medieval fortress on the Ile de la Cité, became her final earthly kingdom. Cell number 11 measured barely 8 feet by 6 feet, its stone walls weeping with dampness that turned her breath to mist in the perpetual twilight. Here, the woman who had once commanded Versailles was reduced to sleeping on a straw mattress, watched day and night by 2 gendarmes who showed her no privacy, even in her most intimate moments. For 76 days, Marie Antoinette existed in this stone purgatory, her body slowly surrendering to the accumulated weight of grief, stress, and despair. Her hair, now completely white, fell out in clumps. Her hands, once soft as silk, became raw and cracked from the cold. She ate little, thin broths and crusts of bread that she could barely force down her constricted throat. The servants who attended her later testified that she seemed to be fading, like a candle burning down to its last inch of wick. On October 14, 1793, they came for her final performance. The 2-day trial was a theatrical mockery, with prosecutors hurling accusations of treason, incest, and conspiracy, while she sat in her simple black dress, dignity intact despite the grotesque charade unfolding around her. When the inevitable verdict was read, death by guillotine, she received it with the same quiet grace that had carried her through 2 decades of impossible expectations. On the morning of October 16th at 7 o'clock, her maid found her lying on her side, hand pressed to her cheek, staring out the narrow window at the gray Paris dawn. She wore her black dress-like armor, preparing for her final, most terrible public appearance. At 12:15 p.m. on October 16, 1793, the guillotine's blade fell, and with it ended not just a life, but an entire conception of divine monarchy that had ruled Europe for 1,000 years. Marie Antoinette's head, held aloft by the executioner Charles-Henri Sanson, represented the final severing of the ancient bond between heaven and earthly power. The crowd that had screamed for her blood fell into a strange, almost reverent silence, as if they suddenly understood the magnitude of what they had witnessed. But history, that most unreliable of witnesses, would prove far more complex than the revolutionary mob could have imagined. The woman they had condemned as a treacherous spendthrift would be revealed by modern historians as largely powerless, a convenient scapegoat for problems that preceded her arrival in France by decades. The Austrian spy had actually tried desperately to save the French monarchy, often against Austria's own interests. The queen, who supposedly bankrupted France with her extravagance, had spent less on her entire wardrobe than the government spent on a single military campaign. Most cruelly ironic of all, Marie Antoinette never said, "Let them eat cake." The phrase, attributed to various nobles throughout history, became forever linked to her name by revolutionary propagandists who understood that sometimes a lie repeated often enough becomes more powerful than truth. She became the embodiment of aristocratic callousness, despite having established charitable hospitals, supported struggling artists, and genuinely grieved for the poor who died in bread riots. Thomas Jefferson, writing decades later, would admit that without Marie Antoinette's presence as a focal point for popular rage, there might have been no revolution at all. She had become in death what she could never be in life, truly powerful, her image reshaping nations and toppling governments across Europe as monarchs fled their thrones rather than face similar fates. Today, visitors to the Conciergerie can see the chapel erected where her cell once stood, its walls painted with silver tears in remembrance of France's last queen, the revolution that destroyed her in the name of liberty, equality, and fraternity would itself collapse into the terror, consuming Robespierre and countless others in the same mechanical brutality they had inflicted upon her. Perhaps the ultimate question is not whether Marie Antoinette deserved her fate, but whether any human being deserves to become a symbol so powerful that their individual humanity disappears entirely. In seeking to kill a queen, the revolutionaries created a martyr whose story would outlive them all.